Today on the podcast, we have our monthly news and analysis episode. We have 3 stories. We'll look at how Inside Out 2 is changing Disney's fortunes at the box office. We'll talk about a recently inked agreement between Disney and the Central Florida Tourism Oversight District, what this agreement means for Disney, and how this agreement is the key to moving forward on large theme park projects in Florida. We'll also talk about what those projects are and where, based on some permits, those projects are right now. Lastly, we'll talk a little about Disney legend Richard Sherman, who passed away a few weeks ago. And I have some special audio to go with that segment. Also, I'll just put this up front. We're not going to be able to cover all of the news in this week's episode. Next week, we'll have another slate of stories where we look at Tiana's Bayou Adventure, the drone show over at Disney Springs, and the just-opened Communicore Plaza at Epcot, and a couple of other things. So we have a lot to get through this week and next. But before we jump into all that, I need to thank a few more new Bandcamp subscribers. We're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. I am grateful to each and every person who supports us over on Bandcamp, because without them, this podcast would simply cease to exist. Today, thanks are going out to new subscribers LM, Endor Express, Parrot Head Tom, and Marcus. Thanks to each of you for supporting all we do here. And now, here's the show. Let's start with this. It's been a difficult year for many of the Disney studios, including Pixar. During the pandemic, Turning Red, Luca, and Soul premiered on Disney+. In part, they were there to attract new subscribers to the streaming service, and in part, they were there because most theaters were closed due to COVID. But the line of streaming Pixar titles taught audiences that they could enjoy new Pixar films at home on the streamer. Then Lightyear came out to theaters and lost money, a lot of money. We took a long moment of self-scrutiny after that didn't deliver, said Chief Creative Officer at Pixar, Pete Docter. The team postulated reasons as to why Lightyear did not connect with theater audiences, reasons beyond simply that a large chunk of the audience had migrated to the living room. I think we overestimated the audience's nerd level of being like, oh, that kid in the first Toy Story bought a toy and it was based on a movie. Doctor continued to explain, and this is that movie. That's probably a few layers too deep, because I think people are going, well, where's Mr. Potato Head? Where's Woody? After Lightyear, Pixar released Elemental, which also fell short of expectations, not even clearing $30 million domestically during its opening weekend. When that movie came out, Pete Docter explained, we all said, oh no, that didn't open the way we thought it should. But as time went on, it just had legs. I don't know if the marketing was wrong, the space was too crowded, or people thought it just didn't look interesting. But word of mouth made people go check it out. Eventually, this film turned a profit, but only a small one. This was the summer where many studios said about many titles, eventually it'll make money, which was a very different way of judging movies than how they were viewed before the pandemic. Over many months, Elemental took in $496 million at the worldwide box office, about half of which went back to Disney, against a production budget of roughly $200 million. But that $200 million didn't include its marketing budget. Still, with Disney Plus and home video, the film should eventually earn out. We have a lot of different revenue streams, explained Jim Morris, Pixar's president. We have revenue from streaming, theme parks, and consumer products. This will certainly be a profitable film for the Disney company. Elemental opened to a large audience on Disney Plus, taking in 26.4 million views in the first 5 days, significantly more than other films that had migrated over to Disney's streaming service, such as Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. Elemental was the streamer's most watched premiere of the year. Still, from a financial standpoint, viewers on Disney Plus contribute far less to a film's bottom line than viewers in an actual theater where they buy tickets. None of these films, from Onward through Elemental, were large successes for Pixar, a studio that until 2020 had produced hit after hit after hit. I should point out that nearly all studios were struggling through this period, but what was clear was that Pixar could not continue to create costly films if they didn't earn out at the box office. After this string of disappointments, executives at Disney put Pixar on a new path, one that focused more on characters with whom the audience was already familiar. Pixar was also given orders to reduce cost, which meant layoffs. Last month, in May 2024, Pixar laid off 175 employees, about 14% of its workforce. 1 in 7 employees were gone. Part of our strategy, Pete Docter said, is to try to balance our output with more sequels. It's hard. Everybody says, why don't you do more original stuff? And then when we do, people don't see it because they're not familiar with it. With sequels, people think, oh, I've seen that. I know that I like it. Sequels are very valuable that way. On the other hand, they're almost harder than originals because we can't do the same idea again. We have to build on it, hopefully in ways that people don't expect. In essence, moving forward from this point, Pixar now might be able to justify one film with new characters for each sequel it produces, thereby trying to even out its portfolio with projects that already have a built-in audience. This also means that Pixar needs to shift away from quiet films that largely explored personal experience, even if that experience was represented with sea creatures or characters made of fire or water, in favor of characters that have the potential to appeal to a far larger audience. What I've found is, Docter added, sometimes if you're telling a personal story, you'll be like, oh no, that's not the way the story goes, because my story is this. But we're not telling my story. We're telling a story that needs to work for a fictional character that we're creating. By the end of 2023, Pixar had already reached out to both Tom Hanks and Tim Allen about the possibility of reprising their roles as Woody and Buzz for another Toy Story film. And beyond this, there are reports or strong rumors that the studio is exploring new sequels for the Incredibles and Finding Nemo franchises. Essentially, this means that Pixar is now on a path, likely ordered by Bob Iger, to shift away from features that have an art house feel like Luca Turning Red and Soul, and instead focus more on populist pictures like Toy Story and Cars with easily recognizable characters, and a means of hopefully balancing Pixar's books in a post-COVID, streaming-dominated media universe. Beyond this focus on safe and sure sequels, another part of the solution is to cut costs. Other studios like Lucasfilm and Marvel have the ability to cut costs by reducing special effects sequences, which are largely outsourced, but most work at Pixar is done in-house. This means that cost reductions need to be arranged both through layoffs and by pivoting away from Disney Plus and focusing on theatrical features. That is, with fewer artists now at Pixar, they can't produce widely for both the streaming service and for the big screen. Well, when they first announced Disney Plus, we immediately jumped in with a bunch of shorts, Docter explained. Turns out the audience didn't want short little things, from Pixar at least. It just didn't perform well. So Disney asked us to pull back on anything that's not the features. We've also found the better a movie does at the theater, the more successful it has been on Disney Plus. If you remove Lightyear from the mix, as it was more of a spin-off than a true sequel, Pixar hasn't released a sequel in 5 years, since Toy Story 4 in June 2019, which also was its last financial hit. Inside Out 2, as it was planned, would be a return to that strategy of bringing successful characters back to the screen for new adventures. But as the opening date for Inside Out 2 approached, many at Pixar contemplated what it would mean if this film also failed. It would mean that the audience had shifted even away from the best-known Pixar stories, which was being pitched as the strategy to save the studio. So if this doesn't do well at the theater, Pete Docter contemplated, I think it just means we're going to have to think even more radically about how we run our business. If the box office doesn't support that, if the economics don't support that, we just have to make even more giant shifts. But if Inside Out 2 as a sequel didn't work for theaters, many at Pixar knew that there wasn't yet another developed backup plan to put the studio on a new course. If this film failed, there would likely be another wave of layoffs beyond the ones that had already been announced. But then Pixar saw its luck begin to shift. The trailer for Inside Out 2 received 157 million views in its first 24 hours, which was an extremely positive sign. Public interest in the film following that began to grow. In the days leading up to the film's opening, analysts first projected an $80 to $85 million domestic opening, then an $85 to $90 million domestic opening based on advanced ticket sales, and about halfway through the week before the film hit screens, those estimates were again raised to $95 million, which was an extremely positive sign. But all of these figures were wildly off by about 60%. Inside Out 2 had the biggest opening weekend of the year, taking in $155 million domestically, pulling far ahead of Dune 2, which previously held this year's record. Inside Out 2 also brought in $295 million worldwide, and still the film hasn't even opened in many significant overseas markets, including China, France, Italy, Japan, and Spain. In terms of animated features, Inside Out had the second highest domestic box office opening of all time, behind The Incredibles 2 back in 2018. To put it simply, Inside Out 2 beat the already high opening estimates, riding largely on character familiarity, strong word of mouth, and positive reviews, with a 91% freshness rating on Rotten Tomatoes. There are some other factors that likely played into its early success. Theaters presently aren't oversaturated with family content. They also aren't oversaturated with content from various Disney studios, including Marvel and Star Wars, which allows the company to fully focus on promotional material for Inside Out 2, and also in the Disney ecosystem, makes the film feel a little more special. One takeaway lesson here may be that fewer Disney films in the marketplace allow those that are released to do better. Hopefully this configurement also works well for Marvel's forthcoming Deadpool and Wolverine, which is the only Marvel film to be released for the entirety of 2024. Even after opening weekend, Inside Out 2 is still doing well at the box office, so well that it might be the first film this year to break $1 billion at the global box office. And even if it doesn't, Inside Out 2 has an estimated budget of $170 to $180 million or thereabouts, meaning that it will need to sell about $400 million in tickets to break even. It should do that by the end of its second weekend, meaning any money after that is profit. Inside Out 2 was also Disney's biggest opening for any type of movie since COVID hit in 2020. So executives are likely closely studying this film, how it was marketed and presented, how its story elements appeal to an audience, and so on, to figure out how to duplicate its success in the near future. The market is, of course, different for tentpole films post-COVID, but there's still a market, even if that market is now smaller. Executives now need to figure out how to arrange studio output to best meet these new and likely lower levels of theatrical demand toward profitability. Inside Out 2, with its strong story, interesting and familiar characters, and compelling visuals, seems to be part of the path that hopefully helps the various Disney studios build again toward theatrical success. Our next story, and the longest story in this episode, is about the end, hopefully, to Disney's governmental struggles in Florida and how all of this will change the Florida resort moving forward. Last month, we discussed how the Disney Land Forward proposal, which is now fully approved, created a path for Disney to move with confidence in planning out how to expand the Disney resort in California. In terms of cost and value, the low-hanging fruit in the Disneyland Forward arrangement is either the park expansion in the downtown Disney parking lot or the park expansion in the Disneyland Hotel parking lot, or work on the east side of the park to reclaim the bus drop-off area for park expansion, and then to move that bus loading zone somewhere across the street, perhaps along with a new parking structure. I would expect to see some plans for Disneyland in one of these two areas, likely one of those parking lots at D23 in August. But a similar story this past month played out in Central Florida. This story, as most of you know, started back in March of 2022 and resulted in the sunsetting of the Reedy Creek Special Improvement District and the creation of the new Central Florida Tourism Oversight District, that's the CFTOD, whose members were selected by Governor DeSantis. We won't go into the ins and outs of that feud, as we've talked about its elements in many previous news shows. But suffice to say, for these past 2 years, Disney executives and the governor of Florida had a fairly public feud, which left Disney vulnerable to what they perceived as a possible political payback through the regulation and permitting arm of the CFTOD, which as a special district oversaw the Disney resort. I still think that Disney had a very good case in arguing that the sunsetting of Reedy Creek was political retaliation for Bob Chapek's and the Disney company's protected free speech in 2022, as this is pretty much what Governor DeSantis said in both his memoir and in various speeches. But the resolution of these problems through the court, no matter the outcome, would have likely taken years, which would have placed Disney in a position where they needed to work with what they perceived as an antagonistic governmental structure if they wanted to arrange large expansions to the Florida resort, which at minimum required multiple permits and possible changes to that pre-2022 Reedy Creek comprehensive plan for how the resort would be developed. If you look over what new attractions have been proposed and engaged from 2022 to the present 2024, you'll see a lot of attraction rethemes, as I'm guessing, at least in part, these projects required fewer permits and fewer engagements with the CFTOD. So we have this long line of redos and rethemes, such as Country Bear's Test Track, It's Tough to Be a Bug, the show The Voyage of the Little Mermaid, and of course Splash Mountain. I should point out that there are a couple of projects, such as that brand new Polynesian DVC tower that did require traditional permits for entirely new structures. But in terms of in-park attractions, when given a choice for the past 2 years, Disney has repeatedly chosen projects that required minimal permitting. None of the projects that I just listed required large structural work. These projects were all about either redoing existing show elements, such as with Country Bears, or pulling out show elements and adding new ones, such as with Splash Mountain. But the permitting elements for each of these show redos or rethemes didn't or wouldn't require a large exposure on Disney's part to whatever the perceived whims were at the CFTOD. Though Disney never announced this, it seemed clear that Disney wasn't planning to begin with large construction projects until they had a more secure path forward with the CFTOD. They would finish existing projects such as Communicore Plaza, as most of that had been overseen and approved by Reedy Creek before the CFTOD came into existence. But the large pattern during these 2 years was to move forward with projects which required minimal outside oversight. Again, this is not something that Disney officially said, but just a defined pattern during this period. And as you might guess, this arrangement helped no one. Without meaningful new expansions and new attractions, Disney would see fewer guests, particularly repeat guests in their parks and hotels, as new experiences are what brings millions back to the resort each year. And with lower levels of tourism, the state of Florida and various local districts would lose out on substantial tax revenue. If the pandemic taught the Florida state government anything at all, it was how deeply tied they were in terms of financial revenue to the state's large tourist draws, such as Disney World and Universal. So with a plan in which everyone would lose, except of course for the lawyers, earlier this year behind the scenes, Disney and members of the CFTOD worked out an arrangement. Basically, everyone decided to just kiss and make up for the financial good of all. As we talked about in our last news episode last month, Disney and the CFTOD announced a tentative agreement, which still needed to be approved, and as a result, Disney agreed to pause its federal lawsuit against Florida. And then at the end of May, the CFTOD announced that they would vote on this proposal on June 5th. The agreement defined what Disney could build. Not that they were obligated to build all of these things, but what they could build in a revised development plan for the resort area. And here I'll read some elements from that announcement with a little bit of commentary. Under this new comprehensive plan, Disney can build a maximum of 53,467 rooms for all hotels on property. This means up to about 17,000 new hotel rooms, including DVC. They can build no more than 5 minor theme parks. This clearly includes water parks, but it may include other developments like that old Richard Petty drive-in experience, and perhaps something like that once proposed adult-focused Night Kingdom park from back in 2008, also something like Discovery Cove over at SeaWorld, or that 5-acre Peppa Pig theme park over at Legoland. That is, there are ways to think about minor theme parks outside of water parks. In fact, I'd say one way to think about the post-2020 wave of new theme parks is to look at them as smaller theme parks focused on a specific age group. Universal, for example, has recently announced a theme park for Texas, wholly focused on kids 12 and younger. Universal has also announced a minor horror-themed park for Las Vegas, which is clearly directed at adults. Some of this age-focused thinking may make its way into Disney. A major theme park needs to speak to the needs of the whole family, but a minor theme park might be able to speak to the needs of one segment of the population. Right now, the Magic Kingdom is the park with the most attractions for young children, which is one of the reasons it's the most popular park. The other 3 Disney parks simply don't have large holdings that are arranged for families with young kids. I do think that there may be a way to arrange and market a minor park at the Florida resort focused on families with kids, say 7 and under. That would benefit the resort and perhaps remove some of the overheated daily demand for the Magic Kingdom. I'm just saying that a minor park with, let's say, Bluey, the Fab Five, Disney Junior, and maybe a few key Disney features like Frozen could be combined into an enjoyable and profitable 20 or 30 acre park that could be open, let's say, from 9 to 5 most days, just like the water parks. And before I get a bunch of email, I do know that Bluey is not a Disney property, but Bluey is shown in the US on Disney Plus, and it's wildly popular with kids. And because of this, there's clearly already some relationship in place between the two companies, which might be finessed to eventually include American theme park rights for those Bluey characters. Lastly, in that CFTOD agreement, the Florida resort can build no more than 5 major theme parks. This leaves Disney with the possibility of building a 5th gate. But honestly, I think a 5th gate is a long shot. I'm not sure what a 5th major park would bring to the resort, especially when the Magic Kingdom, Hollywood Studios, and Animal Kingdom clearly need additional attractions and expanded capacity. It would be difficult to market the resort as a destination that requires more than a week to experience, though of course there are some exceptions. Most families view 1 week as the upper end reach of most any family vacation, whether it's Hawaii, Yellowstone, Washington, D.C., or Disney World. Adding in a fifth park along with everything else that's already at the resort is probably not going to push a large number of families to consider an 8 or 9 day vacation on Disney property. And for families visiting the resort for 4 or 5 days, a fifth park will simply shift visitation centers without significantly expanding the length of vacation. However, expanding and improving the existing parks will deeply encourage return tourism, which is Disney's bread and butter. The Grand Canyon, for example, may be for most families a one-and-done vacation, but Disney World is arranged to be a repeat experience. And if Disney can encourage families to return a bit more often, that likely has more financial upside than the draw of a fifth park. Beyond this, improvements to the existing parks can be managed over time, with the cost spread out over many years in terms of CapEx funds, whereas a new park mostly needs to be finished all at once. To put this simply, a fifth park probably isn't going to expand the length of a typical family vacation to the resort. It will mean that even fewer people now visit Animal Kingdom and more visit whatever that new fifth park is. And so I'd say the more likely plan here is to bump out existing parks, except for Epcot, with new areas over the next decade, rather than to build a new park which would add deeply to the operation and maintenance costs of the resort. In this arrangement, the only element that Disney has formally agreed to is an $8 billion investment in the resort over the next 10 years, with a $17 billion investment as the target for the next 20. Beyond the resort itself, the CFTOD agreement included other stipulations. First, that Disney would use 50% local businesses for design, development, and construction work. As Orlando already has a large number of companies focused on the construction of theme parks, this is probably already happening. Second, Disney will invest a minimum of $10 million in low-cost housing projects. And again, Disney is already working on an 80-acre 1,400 unit affordable housing project for employees and local residents. Third, Disney would be required to report capital expenditures year by year to the CFTOD, thereby ensuring that Disney would be making adequate investments in terms of renewing and expanding the resort. On June 5th, the CFTOD board reviewed the proposal and unanimously approved it, though the proposal also required a second vote a week later to finalize it. 1 week later, the CFTOD board cast that vote, which solidified the proposal and Disney's investment obligations. Around this time, with both sides burying the hatchet and establishing a framework to move forward, a number of things quickly began to happen. On Thursday, June 13th, Disney dropped its lawsuit against the governor in the state of Florida, focused on its free speech rights and what was perceived as a political retaliation. In late May and early June, the CFTOD began to explore how they could invest with tax funds $100 million in terms of road improvements within the resort area, with most of this focused on infrastructure improvements at the resort, not simply maintenance. One of the large ongoing road projects presently is to improve traffic flow to the Magic Kingdom and those Magic Kingdom resort hotels. Already, the Special District has completed a number of road expansions and flyovers that move guests more smoothly and efficiently into the Magic Kingdom parking area. One of the next steps, though, is to improve traffic flow to the Grand Floridian and the Polynesian, a set of 2-lane roads that will become even more impacted once that new DVC Polynesian Tower opens in December. Another area where change was seen during this period was with Disney's relationship with Florida politicians. Following that 2022 feud, Disney suspended political contributions to Florida political candidates, but has now, in small ways, turned those back on. Initially, these political contributions aren't cash, but instead in-kind donations, such as theme park tickets, hotel rooms, meals, venues for fundraising events, and even the use of theme park characters in advertising. For an upcoming political fundraiser, Florida Senator Geraldine Thompson was allowed to use the image of Tiana on invitations for her June event. She also received passes to the park for this event that she could use as gifts to donors. While they can't write checks, this is an opportunity for me to raise funds with my campaign and with substantial support from Disney, she said. For a $250 donation, that donor would receive one Disney theme park ticket. For $500, they would receive two, and so on. So far, as Disney brings its political contributions back online, it has supported both Democrat and Republican candidates with in-kind donations. And this brings more normalcy back to Disney's relationship with Florida politicians, particularly those in Orange and Osceola counties, and also the way that Disney is trying to manage influence in terms of regulation that affects the resort. The largest area of change, though, over these past few weeks concerns construction projects at the resort moving forward, particularly in regards to the theme parks. For the past 6 months, Disney executives have repeatedly pointed to recent expansions at the Florida resort, such as Galaxy's Edge, Cosmic Rewind, the Tron Coaster, and so on, as a type of pre-planning against expansion over at Universal. For the Wall Street Journal, one Disney spokesperson tried to spin the lack of announced projects moving forward for Disney World this way. Well, Epic Universe is Universal playing catch-up on a decade of nonstop development at Disney World. But I don't think that most fans were having much of this particular interpretation. The lack of any large projects opening next summer to counter Epic Universe is a tremendous problem. One that will likely lead to serious discounting of Disney hotel rooms and park tickets when the new attraction Advantage, that is the things that draw people to Florida, shifts more from Disney over to Universal. But with this new arrangement in place between the CFTOD and Disney, Iger is clearly working to correct that imbalance, though it will take time. As we've previously talked about, concept art is not a guarantee of anything now. Concept art can produce an attraction, or it can simply be a window into how WDI is thinking about the parks. Permits are a far surer indication that work is moving forward on park-related projects. Around the discussion of the CFTOD agreement with Disney was a flurry of permit applications indicating that some fairly large projects are about to get started at the resort. On May 23rd, Disney filed a commencement notice to install storage and work trailers behind Animal Kingdom, likely as a staging ground for Imagineers. This is following an earlier parking and work area permit filed with the Water Management District. Almost surely, though there is no official announcement yet, this is for the Tropical Americas area earmarked to replace Dinoland. Again, no official dates have been attached to this project, but if you want one last ride on Dinosaur, I'd get in this ride by the end of summer. Some entertainment in the Dinoland area has been extended until mid-September, which may signal the close date or thereabouts. Or at the very least, it signals that the area will likely be open until then. Beyond the exact timeline for this project, at minimum, Disney would at least like to point to one, if not two, large ongoing construction projects next year when they are asked, likely over and over by the media, how they are responding to Epic Universe. New buildings, construction walls, and a big dirt pit over in Animal Kingdom will supply much-needed visuals to support that argument. And by that point, I would guess there may even be two large projects then underway. Over in the Magic Kingdom, Disney has applied for a 1-year permit to refurbish Big Thunder. The refurb permit, which is assigned to Coastal Steel, is not unusual, likely for track work or track replacement. But if Big Thunder is closed for a year, This also seems like it just might be timed to coincide with the beginning of the Beyond Big Thunder project, which would put a new set of themed areas at the far side of Rivers of America, possibly including one for Disney villains. And for a moment, let me just lay out some of the competitive groundwork here. Over at Epic Universe, that Universal Park will have a whole land themed to classic film monsters, i.e. villains, from the 1930s, such as Frankenstein, Dracula, the werewolf, and so on. And if this is successful, and I'm guessing it will be, this should nudge Disney to respond with a classic villains area of their own, with Maleficent, Jafar, Cruella, Captain Hook, Stromboli, Ursula, and so on. Or at least here's hoping it plays out that way. But to get back to the topic at hand, almost surely Big Thunder will need to be closed for many months as a pedestrian path is arranged around or maybe through the Big Thunder attraction. And this is why I'm guessing that the coaster refurb, which has been announced, will go hand in hand with the beginning of the Beyond Big Thunder project. I would guess that the Beyond Big Thunder project would involve 2 or possibly 3 smaller themed areas, similar to Galaxy's Edge or Toy Story Land, moving around the backside of the river. I am also guessing that the river will be shortened to add more space for the expansion. But if I'm reading the permits and guessing at the timeline correctly, this means that Disney could create a path around or through Big Thunder next year, and then perhaps 2 years later, around 2027 or 2028, open the first of these themed areas, and then a couple years later, open the second, until the loop is complete all the way over to either the Mansion area or Fantasyland. This would give Disney the largest marketing and PR bang for their buck, as each new area would be the anchor around which the resort could define its annual advertising campaign. By opening each area individually, they would get 2 or 3 waves of excellent advertising and PR, not just one. Beyond this, Disney has announced 2 more things. Josh D'Amaro, who is the chairperson for Disney Experiences, which oversees the parks, recently said that there would be even more announcements beyond the Big Thunder and Tropical Americas projects. And Bob Iger, in a presentation with a Moffett-Nathanson summit, explained that most, though not all, investment in park attractions moving forward would be based on existing film IP. His list of examples also suggested that these attractions would be based more on recent IP, such as Frozen and Tangled, than older IP, such as Sleeping Beauty and Pinocchio. And even outside of those areas we've already discussed, there are signs that other improvements are coming soon to the Florida parks. Disney has already announced a replacement for the Voyage of the Little Mermaid Theater, which will also be a show based on The Little Mermaid, with updated costumes, puppets, and technology, including live digital characters arranged with motion capture, similar to Turtle Talk over at the Seas Pavilion. A casting call for lead performers for this show went out this past February. Some of the new physical puppets, based on press photos, appear to be finished. From what I understand, there was also extensive water and mold damage that needed to be fixed inside the theater itself. But even with all this, I would expect this show to be open before Thanksgiving. Likewise, over at the Magic Kingdom, Tortuga Tavern, which is just across the way from Pirates of the Caribbean, has closed, likely for good. Though not yet announced, this may be the location for a new Pirates of the Caribbean tavern experience. Other than that the old Barker Bird, once a fixture in Adventureland, will be part of this new tavern, little has been announced about this project. But in looking around the resort, I would guess that this would be the Magic Kingdom's answer to Oga's Cantina, which in terms of income is an absolute goldmine. Replace Rex with the Barker Bird, add in some cast members dressed as pirates, put up some treasure maps on the wall, and have a menu filled with rum drinks. And that, I think, is a reasonable guess as to what may be eventually in this tavern. Lastly, Disney just filed an unusually lengthy permit for the Imagination Pavilion, one that goes far beyond the typical year given to most permits. It will extend all the way until November 2025. It's possible that this might be related to a reimagined Journey into Imagination attraction. Also, to tie this back to our very first story today, with the blockbuster business that Inside Out 2 is doing in theaters right now, I'm guessing that Disney is at least dusting off some old concepts that once would have changed this attraction to one that was more focused on the characters from that movie franchise. But also, this permit may be simply more tied to a refurbishment of the DVC lounge that is on the second story of that structure. Still, with the extended permit time, this is at least another area of the parks to keep your eye on. The current ride in that pavilion, I think as we all know, isn't really a big draw in its current incarnation. It's a thin shadow of that fabulous original attraction that opened during Epcot's first year, and really, an updated attraction could, if done right and with a large budget, be a sizable draw for that side of Epcot. Whether the new attraction would be with Figment or the Inside Out characters, or maybe a combination of both of them, as both properties explore how the human mind creates and reacts to the world around them. But regardless, with an agreement between Disney and the CFTOD, also with commitments for large CapEx investments and a need to play catch-up with Universal and Epic Universe, we are finally at a point where we should start to see some fairly large projects announced for the Florida resort. That, I believe, should be one of the centerpiece presentations hopefully arranged for the D23 event or expo, or whatever it's presently called, when it happens in August. Our final segment today is focused on Richard Sherman, who passed away on May 25th at the age of 95, just a couple of weeks shy of 96. A few years back, we explored the life of Richard Sherman along with his brother Bob on this podcast, looking at various projects that together they worked on for Walt and the Disney studio. Walt had certain people to whom he regularly returned on key projects, people such as Ward Kimball, Mary Blair, Herb Ryman, Mark Davis, and of course, the Sherman Brothers. The Sherman Brothers were songwriters whose work appeared in multiple Disney films: The Jungle Book, the Winnie the Pooh feature and featurettes, The Happiest Millionaire, and of course Mary Poppins. Their work was also featured in The Tiki Room, Adventure Through Inner Space, Carousel of Progress, and It's a Small World, among many other projects. Richard, or Dick as he was more often called in person, was always enthusiastic, engaging, optimistic, and was able to see the best in any project he worked on. He was always helpful for those wishing to better understand how the studio worked back in the 1950s and 1960s. He was a sweet, sweet person. When he passed away, I went back and listened to some old conversations I had with him nearly 20 years ago. And from those, right now, I have a clip of Dick talking about his time with Walt. The audio is now about 20 years old. It was recorded at Disneyland with the carousel behind us. Some of the Calliope songs are ones that Dick co-wrote with his brother. And all this was recorded many, many years before I started writing about him. Here in this clip, he talks about how Walt insisted that he and his brother keep the rights to the song It's a Small World, as even then Walt understood that the song had the potential to become a theme park favorite, something that would help support Dick's family, even though initially Dick and his brother Bob wanted to donate their share of the rights to UNICEF, which was the co-sponsor of the attraction when it first appeared at the 1964 World's Fair.
Could you tell me the story about how Walt asked you not to give up the royalties to Small World?
Oh, well, when we finished the song, it was a job, and we felt, well, we'd done it okay, and everybody seemed to like the song very much, so we said, well, it's for UNICEF. It was done for the UNICEF Pavilion at the World's Fair. And Bob and I, my brother Bob and I, talked it over and said, well, UNICEF's a great organization. Why don't, if they ever make a record or something, let's just donate the money to UNICEF. So we said that to Walt as we were driving back from this meeting where we had first played it for the Imagineers. And he parked the car. He just brought the car to the side of the road. He said, "You're not going to give that song away. That song is going to put your kids through college." He says, "I don't want to talk about that anymore. You want to give a donation to UNICEF anytime, but don't give away your royalties." And with that was the end of it. And, of course, he was so right.
Did it put your kids through college?
Well, I'd say it certainly helped.
It paid for some dorm expenses?
It helped quite a bit. Yes, it did. It still helps.
And no matter where Dick is now, his music remains with us. He is one of the few people I've met whose work has touched not millions of people, but hundreds of millions of people, if not more. His work for Mary Poppins helped create what is surely Walt's most successful live-action feature, and his theme song for It's a Small World is included in Disney parks around the world. No matter what time of day it is, somewhere in the world right now, in some Disney castle park, people are listening to a song he wrote, and people will likely still be listening to that many decades into the future. He and his brother left a very large mark on the musical culture of the world. I'll be back next week with a new show. And next week, among other things, we'll look at all of those recently opened attractions and experiences at Disney World. Also, over on Bandcamp, I have just assembled the 11-part series, The Opening of Walt Disney World, into an album. It runs in total about 6 hours. So if you have a summer drive and you want to explore how the Disney team, after Walt died, put together the company's largest project, that story is now arranged into a Bandcamp album. As with all of our albums over on Bandcamp, just open the album, click on the first episode, and then the entire series will play until you hit pause or until the story ends. That's streaming right now. As you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We do just two things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and the parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. We are funded entirely by listener contributions, specifically by listeners who join us over on Bandcamp as monthly supporters. On Bandcamp, you will find well over 200 episodes not available on iTunes or anywhere else. But the best reason to join us there is to support the work we do and to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can support us by becoming a monthly subscriber at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in the show notes. So, until next week, this is Todd James Pierce.